Warning, Star Trek from the Holodeck contains adult language and discussions. If you're easily offended, do not continue to listen.
Lock and load!
Fire!
Holodeck 3 program is reinstated.
Open sesame!
Commander Klingon vessel. We are energizing transporter beam. Now.
One, engage!
All right, so we're here to discuss episode 9 of the 5th and final season of Star Trek Lower Decks. Hello, David. How are you?
Hello, everybody.
This is an episode that I didn't think we'd ever get, even though this is a show that pretty much pulls things out of their ass at any given moment. We never really know what we're going to get, but still, I didn't think we would ever see DePaul ever again in Star Trek, David.
Yes, or even Kim.
Garrick,
Kim, Bashir.
This was the episode I think a lot of fans who are very much aware at this point what Lower Decks is all about, having fun, Easter eggs, Star Trek references, callbacks. This is the episode that I believe many fans have been waiting for all season.
Oh, yeah, because especially since, like when it comes to Lower Decks up to this point, the way they handle Easter eggs and references, I think, is the best out of all the Star Trek shows. Because Mike McMahon has a way of giving us those Easter eggs, but not taking away from his story. He doesn't. He wants to make those Easter eggs and references tie into his narrative.
No, I would agree. Yes, he's here to have some fun, but at the end of the day, at the end of that fun, there's usually a narrative purpose.
Yes.
A narrative reason behind why he's introducing something or bringing something back into it. So just to get this episode started more formally, Fissure Quest is the episode title, the penultimate episode of Star Trek Lower Decks' final season, which delivers a multiverse-spanning adventure packed with callbacks, legacy character returns, and heartfelt storytelling. The episode brings a compelling mix of humor, action, and I suppose you can say emotional depth.
A bit.
Because you had a few aspects that we're going to get into about the relationships, a multi-universe spanning relationships. This is something you and I have talked about in detail pertaining to the Kelvin timeline, specifically Spock and Kirk, and how a friendship in an alternate timeline also happens despite time infractions, things that change the course of the future, and yet they all end up finding in some way the timeline somewhat repairs itself.
Yes.
Not quite right, but it still somewhat starts to begin to feel familiar.
Yeah, because it's kind of like that idea that even though it was introduced in the final moments of the reboot movie of Star Trek, where it's basically everything starts to realign itself in the end. You still have that moment where, Spock is overseeing the grand ceremony, but he's seeing the elements starting to repair itself, whether it be Pike in a wheelchair. Yeah, he's not in the spot that Spock remembers, but he still ends up semi-retired in a wheelchair.
That's one thing that I've always liked about the Kelvin timeline. There was that idea that things will, despite it being different, and there's certain things that you cannot change once it happens in that timeline. However, if things are supposed to be a certain way,
yes,
which also presents a bit of a deterministic view on the world of Star Trek. It overlays a deterministic framework over Star Trek in itself, which causes some discrepancies and some issues. However, how else do you look at it? If we are to believe that timelines will find a way to align properly, it will never be a one-to-one, but they attempt to. That's what the Kelvin timeline did, where you have Kirk eventually sitting in that chair, Spock becoming his first officer, Scotty finding himself, though he's across the galaxy, he miraculously finds himself on a planet where Spock was abandoned,
Yes.
Kirk was abandoned, and then they all unite and get back onto the Enterprise.
He still ends up on the Enterprise somehow.
Yeah, that's always been a very interesting thing about the Kelvin timeline. And then when you look at what Mike McMahon is doing here with the multiverse, you still have those little aspects of things aligning in ways that we otherwise never saw, because that's not how the Prime Universe was. However, you still see those similar relationships. You have Garrick and Bashir. You have DePaul and Tucker. You have Ensign Kim, who's still an ensign in most universes.
Dude, I was so cracking up when the running gag for Ensign Kim. Mike McMahon basically makes the joke that all of us Star Trek fans make fun of poor Garrett Wang and his portrayal of Kim, is that every single universe of Kim, he is not allowed to actually be more than one Pip, because now we see what 2 Pips does to Kim, and it drives him crazy and makes him evil. So we can't have that.
2 Pip Kim.
2 Pip Kim.
Yeah, that's what we're going to call the next serial killer.
See, that's what
2 Pip Kim.
I mean, is that the reason why, Mike, you've never given me a second Pip?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I have teased, I believe I've called you a lieutenant a few times.
Yes. And it sometimes went to my head.
Yeah, I always end up demoting you. No 2 Pip David.
No 2 Pip
on
David.
this ship.
But dude, I love the fact that they took a ongoing joke that we've had even before Lower Decks.
Yeah.
For Star Trek fans, and Mike McMahon found a way to take that quote unquote meme joke in Trek culture and turn it into something that basically can tie to his narrative, particularly with the Lower Decks crew. Because it's amazing to me that basically this episode is the one that really put everything in focus, with when me and you the past season have been saying, man, this is a really hard season to understand because there's not
understand. We were having writing
issues with it,
right?
with the story arc. And then this particular episode hits, and it shows Mike McMahon's kind of talent of making his theme or making his statement, as it were, or any storytelling. That's his story arc. His story arc is basically about how, just like what you alluded to, even though there's like little differences in different universes, it does not change who the person is. The Lower Decks crew will always be the Lower Decks crew, but the thing that makes this particular crew special is that they embody the Star Trek. I guess you could say the one thing that me and you have always said, what Star Trek epitomizes, is optimism. This crew, as ragtag and silly as they are, embody optimism. Like they try to strive to be better, no matter what. I mean, we make fun of Boimler and his lack of story development this year, but in actuality, yeah, he's growing a beard, but that's what's important to his destiny. He wants to act. He's trying to achieve a better version of himself by any means necessary. And while normally stories like that could go very tragically, particularly like with Mike McMahon's history with Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty, you watch that series, you realize that basically trying to be Rick and Morty is miserable, because there's like that existential dread constantly that basically whatever they do, it doesn't matter, because Rick and Morty are stuck doing what they have to do because of whatever machinations have created them, whether it be Evil Rick or Mr. Poopy Butt, anything like that. They have no control. They just basically have to go with the flow.
I mean, I can see those similarities there. Star Trek and Rick and Morty are two very different IPs. So you do have to be a little careful. Even though I enjoyed this episode and how it was written was just fine, I have Star Trek nerd problems with it, particularly with this whole multiverse idea. I know it's not a new idea, but the way it's being explained, it feels more like a comic book. And you got to be careful, because throughout Star Trek's 50 plus year run, they have had different episodes that explored things that they called dimensions, alternate realities, split timelines, alternate Earths. You have to start being careful, because are you trying to consolidate? Is that what they're trying to do in this episode? Are they consolidating all those ideas and just putting them into one term, the multiverse now? Is that what we're doing?
Mm-hmm.
If that's what we're doing, it actually creates more problems throughout the entire run of Star Trek.
Absolutely.
Because what about species 8472? They're described as being from an alternate dimension. So if alternate dimensions are now also alternate realities that are a part of the multiverse, then is just this simply some timeline where these species took over everything and there's no room for human life or biological life?
Yeah, it brings up way too many questions, because like,
You got to be careful with these types of things.
I think the problem is, and I think me and you have touched on this many times in other shows, when it tackles this particular new hotness, as I've always referred to it as, this new hotness idea of writers wanting to use the term multiverse, different realities. That seems to be a new, not a new concept, but a brand new thing that everyone wants to jump at as writers to do, instead of like the stereotypical time travel elements. Let's throw time travel into a story. And now it seems like the idea of a multiverse is like everywhere. Marvel, it's now in Star Trek, it's in, all the comics, DC, and even in shows like, particularly I remember even like Supernatural, dealing with multiverses, different realities. Oh, we got to go to this different reality.
Yeah.
And it's now becoming like the trope, like using flashbacks and using time travel. And I think here, I'm like you. Once he started actually going down the multiverse thing, I was a little put off by it, because I'm like, oh God, not another multiverse. Try not to, because just like you said, when you deal with tropes like that, you just leave yourself open as the writer for so many criticisms.
Yeah.
So many.
Well, and I know that I didn't explain the whole species 8472 completely accurate, but the point's still the same.
Oh yeah, but the Voyager fans out there know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a species that originates from fluidic space, that is described as a separate dimension.
That is the definition of a separate reality.
Yeah, we have to be careful. And I don't feel like we need an episode to come on in and explain everything, because that also can get really messy. We just have to move away from these multiversal stories. The way they explained it in this episode, the multiverse, it can work.
It can work
with the other ideas, but you either have to have an episode that brings all of these ideas together.
Yes.
Because we also have what the Guardian of Forever said in Discovery. You can't change the past.
Exactly.
What you're doing is creating new realities.
And that's why, then see right now, right there, Mike, again, bringing in the element of multiverse challenges a lot of what your past continuity is. Unless you know what your continuity you're working with down to a T, you miss one little thing like that, you can have like your fan base turn on you and basically say, well, how do we make sense of this? And like you, that's the one element in this episode that had me really questioning. But I will say this, Mike McMahon has a way of really bringing into focus his narrative. Like, I appreciate that a lot about like what he's done writing wise, where it's like, okay, I'm going to introduce this really, I guess you could say, experimental or diversive subject, but I'm going to stick true to my narrative. I'm going to make it work for what I'm trying to say for all the characters. What is my grand statement of the series, right? And he seems to always have, for the past couple seasons, a way of making sure. I think you mentioned it off air. Like, he has a way of I forgot what you said. It said like he knows how to fuck with us, but to the point where we're not angry at him.
No, like, even with this stuff, like, nothing he's done in this episode makes me mad. It just makes me concerned for future episodes, because Mike McMahon has the ability to take Star Trek, because the guy is very knowledgeable about Trek, and make the idea of the multiverse work. Now, I'm not saying that this is a new idea, but he is floating it and reifying a view, a multiversal view, in a way that we've never been privy to before from any other Star Trek writer. Now, I have faith in Mike McMahon's ability to make it work in the greater cosmology of Star Trek. Mm-hmm. What I'm concerned is that lesser writers in future Star Trek shows are now going to take this idea and fuck things up.
Exactly.
That's what makes me more nervous. It's not that Mike McMahon can't handle it. And it's not that it was handled poorly in this episode. It was handled fine. It's what it might mean.
Yeah. Essentially what we're saying to our listeners out there is, like, Mike McMahon is opening Pandora's box.
We don't need another Mike Shaban to come in and misinterpret what better writers have done prior.
Exactly.
And then fuck things up. Now, taking a step back and forgetting the whole multiverse thing, let's look at exactly what this episode does in terms of story. So we have Captain William Boimler, who's on a mission to stop the multiverse destroying dimensional fissures. So the whole dimensional rift that are being torn in the galaxy has now been explained. So you have a group of people who work for a version of Starfleet in another timeline. What that timeline is and where it is, we are not quite sure. However, in this form, rather than seeking out strange new worlds and new civilizations, which is the Prime Timeline's mission statement for Starfleet, their mission is very similar, but rather than exploring their own space, their own galaxies within their timeline, they explore alternate realities.
Yes.
And the reasoning behind it is very much sound and very much a part of Gene Roddenberry's entire philosophical outlook on humanity. So the justification is, rather than exploring the galaxy, what better way to learn about humanity than exploring the different alternate variations and inversions of humanity?
That's why I kind of like the whole beginning where he starts. His captain's log essentially reads quantum reality 582.76. And I thought that okay. And it's amazing to me that simply having that right there explains the scenario that we have right now. It's a quantum reality. So automatically it's not our prime universe. And we're now stuck in a different reality in no man's land. And so I thought that was a really good, cool way to actually set up very easily, because you got to understand, Lower Decks is only like, what, 30, 45 minutes? So he doesn't have a lot of time to actually go into, like, what me and you have said earlier is, like, when you tackle something like this, you need an episode to actually try to explain this to us. But Mike McMahon works with what he got, and basically using the captain's log to actually just change it up a bit. Instead of using it to explain a time, he explains it as a reality time.
Yeah. And the thing that I liked most about this entire episode is it kind of confirms what we have been saying for quite some time. We have been floating this idea that the Star Trek universe isn't as free as many like to believe. It is guided, shaped by a type of determinism.
Things have to end up the way they are.
Correct. And this episode all but reconfirms that idea that we've had, because when Lily Sloan talks about why she explores humanity, she specifically mentions the friendships that transcends realities. That Boimler and Mariner are very close, in one reality, and yet in the next, they still find each other and are just as close, which also says a lot about Kirk and Spock, the Kelvin timeline, and the things that we have gone into great detail throughout the last, 10 years of doing this podcast.
Yes.
So I do like that. So Mike McMahon isn't off base here. I don't have a problem with what he's doing when it comes to the multiverse. It's for being a very simple show. He takes a very complicated idea and simplifies it to fit the show itself.
Yes.
But also he doesn't dummy it down or insult anyone's intelligence, because if you take everything that he streamlined down, it does fit with everything that we know of when it comes to Star Trek.
Yeah.
Or at least the things that we can assume, the things that have been suggested, the assertions that have all but been verbally confirmed via text in whatever Star Trek episode it may be. So I will say that Mike McMahon did a very good job taking this multiverse idea and still making it work within the very constrictive Star Trek mythos, because it is.
And that's why me and you have always been champions of the idea of this determinism in the Star Trek mythos, that certain things have to fall into place no matter what.
Well, because you have in Deep Space Nine, they flirted around with the sexuality of both Garrick and Bashir for years. So to have an episode in Lower Decks where a holodeck Bashir and an alt reality Garrick are together, fine. I think that works. And it reifies our own theories that the Star Trek world, the universes, are somewhat deterministic.
Yeah.
Because you also have Harry Kim, as I said, who's an ensign. You have DePaul, who's a first officer, as well as someone who's married to Trip. So even though you're dealing with a 28-minute episode and you're dealing with a complicated idea, you still manage to make it work within a very simple 28-minute running time. And that's where Mike McMahon does, in fact, excel. Episode after episode, even if you don't like the episode, you don't find it as entertaining, he still manages to make so much work in a very limited amount of time.
Oh, yeah. And like, especially, I like the fact that the story, for going back to the Lower Decks crew themselves, the thing that basically ties Boimler and basically makes him a better person is Mariner. It doesn't have to be a romantic thing. It's just basically together they make the proper team that basically can handle the situation. And that's why having Boimler, essentially his clone, kind of have like this crisis of cynicism, essentially, in the very beginning, when he's just, he's kind of burnt out with the world and trying to find his own meaning.
I think that was the point. I think it was a little existential.
Yeah.
I think that Boimler was, I believe what Mike McMahon was trying to say was that when you travel from universe to universe and there's just duplicates after duplicates, he used the word derivative to kind of be a little, to poke fun of himself, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what he was saying is what some of the criticisms that are leveled towards Lower Decks from the fans. But I think the idea was that, doesn't things start to lose meaning when they're all just repeats?
Exactly.
When you have 50 ensigns, Ensign Kims, and 27 mariners,
27 mariners,
then doesn't your own life start to lose meaning? And I feel like that was the original idea at the beginning of the episode, that it wasn't necessarily burnt out. It was like, well, what's the point? Does any of this mean anything?
Yeah. And then in the very end, I love the fact that it comes down to it where Boimler has to make the decision what reality is he going to use as the target for this. Essentially, it's a quantum explosion. And like, he chooses his own reality. Why? Because he has faith in his friends to actually figure it out.
Yeah.
Because being in this scenario and actually getting his quote unquote own Mariner to be his partner makes him realize, oh wait, I have friends. That's what and it's almost like the spark of optimism in the very end that really kind of hit me, because I was like going, I bring up Rick and Morty because this type of element is very reminiscent when I watched the final season of Rick and Morty, where it's kind of like you have this existential crisis of the meaning of one's existence. And then in Rick and Morty, it ends pretty depressing in my opinion. But like,
what do you mean it ends?
With the final ending, it's kind of
don't
like,
get into spoilers.
Yeah, I don't want to get into spoilers about that show, but like,
I get what you're saying.
you know, the existence of Rick and Morty as characters themselves, it's almost very defeatist in the very end. It's a very defeatist mentality. But here, Lower Decks, he decides to take a similar tact, a similar narrative with Rick and Morty, but turn it on its head by introducing the fact, but we have this Star Trek optimism. At the end of the day, that optimism for a better tomorrow will trump anything that gets thrown at you.
Yeah.
And I was like going, that's the way I liked it. And that's the way I liked why I like Lower Decks more than Rick and Morty, I tell people, because it's that Star Trek optimism that basically says, yeah, all these crazy things happen and we might have this deterministic point of view, but there's always a really better tomorrow waiting for us.
Well, that's the difference between Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty is nihilistic. And Star Trek, I would say, is optimistic. And at times they use the existential to find optimism.
There you go. Yeah. And that's why I really dug about like how him and his team kind of wove this episode around essentially kind of one of the main characters, because this is a different Boimler. This is his clone. This isn't really him, but it still kind of ties to our main characters in a way.
Yeah, it's still Boimler.
It's still Boimler because it ties into basically the idea that we brought up is like, no matter what, these characters have to end up in the same spot.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to Jolene Blaylock's DePaul, her return,
you would have like, I saw that, Mike. I was like going, if Mike had his way and could actually have his own ship of many reality, his whole crew, they probably would be all different versions of DePaul.
The whole crew would be DePaul. I'd have one navigator and it'd be 7 of 9.
7 of 9.
That's so stupid. Because I'm a doucher, I think unfairly people just assume that I like DePaul because she's hot. And yes, the actress that plays DePaul is extremely attractive.
Oh yeah, she is.
Okay. But my point, I don't like the character. There's plenty of hot characters in Star Trek and I don't like them. I'm not drawn to them.
Yeah.
I like this character because the character has never got enough credit.
Oh no.
Jolene Blaylock played DePaul so well. We were given the absolute best Vulcan cosmology ever in 50 plus years of Star Trek from Enterprise.
Oh, easily.
The way they fleshed out Vulcan hierarchy, their government, their failings, their oppressive nature, their successes, their redemption, all done in 4 years on Enterprise.
Yeah.
DePaul was the face of that.
Yeah.
DePaul was also, in my opinion, had some of the most philosophical and deeply human stories of Enterprise.
By far.
Learning how to deal with human emotion, alienation, progress, oppositional ideology. She, in a lot of ways, was the character that they used to introduce those ideas into the series. So when people say DePaul was nothing but big boobs and an ass and a cat suit, I'm like, you are not watching the show. I think you're too flabbergasted. But the thing is, even there are women who have written about Star Trek who complain about DePaul, that she was nothing but a way to boost ratings and that she was just a sexualized object. So Jolene Blaylock's DePaul has never been given credit.
Oh yeah.
Ever. She is such a dynamic, interesting character. So to see her being brought back, for me, who's a big fan of that character, it shows an appreciation for a well-written character that has been all but forgotten.
Well, the thing I also love about, particularly with this episode, you mentioned how like all the characters that are brought in from reality, there's little parts of them that have to meet a certain deterministic reality, as it were. You know, like Garrick and Bashir have to end up being with each other and everything else. But particularly with T'Pol, I love the fact that basically what they did for the character was the elements that make her who she is. She is the epitome of Vulcan behavior, but also as a character, she still ends up with Trip in the end. Because you do realize when they make the comment that, oh, she's married to Trip, I'm like going, yes, it's treated kind of like a throwaway, but as Star Trek fans, we're like going, if you're dealing with a story of determinism, that's actually, yeah, we all basically feel T'Pol and Trip needed to be, they're kind of like,
I love that love story too.
That story was so awesome. And to see that that's part of the deterministic value of what makes that character.
David, I will die on this mountain here. You ready? The best relationship in Star Trek,
T'Pol and Trip,
is T'Pol and Trip.
When it comes to romantic relationships.
Yes, romantic relationships, non-platonic relationships. Yeah. I know some people point to Deanna Troi and Riker.
No, man, that was toxic.
I feel like that's one of the worst.
That's one of the worst relationships
in Star Trek. It got better in the movies, but the show, it was kind of like Riker wanted to fuck other people.
Exactly.
And when he found it to be convenient, he would circle back. So much so that when Worf took a chance, he got angry. I didn't like their relationship. I never really was about it. The second best relationship, in my opinion, is Worf and Dax. I love their relationship.
Theirs is underrated. Mine is the Doctor and Seven. The Doctor and Seven
but that's like a platonic relationship. Maybe not from his point of view.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say not from his point of view.
He got friend zoned hard.
He did, exactly. But it was so realistic. I'm like going, dude, I know where you're coming from. I know where you're coming from. But yeah, that's the thing about like every single Star Trek series needs that one quote unquote relationship that is that border of romanticism. And going back to like T'Pol and Trip, that was the one that basically I was like going, everyone kept thinking, I remember everyone was like, should it have been T'Pol and Archer? But I'm like going, no.
When they were doing that, they were doing that. And there was a moment where you can definitely feel that was the direction they were going in.
Yeah.
But luckily they had set little breadcrumbs between her and Trip since day one, so that when they started going back to it, it made sense.
And that's what made it cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, this does bring us to the end of our discussion. This was a two-parter, so the conclusion will be discussed during our next episode. David, give me your RMD score.
My RMD score for this one is a solid 90. I really liked this episode. I know the only element that had me concerned is the overall multiverse element that gets thrown around here as one of the big crutches for the episode, but I like how Mike McMahon handled it because it didn't become a centralized focus.
Yeah.
He focused in on his narrative and then miraculously found a way to actually make every element he brought in work into the actual main, I guess you could say, main Lower Decks crew.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm at a 90% for RMD score. It's not my favorite episode of the season. It's exciting. It was definitely a fun experience for a Star Trek fan to see all those familiar faces, to mess around within the multiverse, which seems to be a favorite amongst a lot of Star Trek fans. Seeing T'Pol again, as well as Garrick. Garrick was one of my favorite characters in Deep Space Nine.
I still say Garrick, the scene with Garrick and Sisko where Garrick scolds Sisko for
when they work together,
and he scolds him and basically says, you brought the guy who could get the job done.
And Sisko knew what he was doing.
Exactly. And Sisko knew what he was
So Garrick, seeing him again,
my favorite.
Bashir, even though he was a hologram, it was still exciting. So the episode was fun, and even in its own way, it's a very clever and smart episode, taking all of these complicated multiverse ideas, if that's the term we're going with now, definitively, and making it work within the 28-minute running time while also bringing up moments of nostalgia without derailing the immediate narrative and pushing, I guess you can say, the loosely composed myth arc of the season.
Yes.
I guess it was what this episode did, really, is bringing those aspects together for the finale. All right, David, that does bring us to the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.
I couldn't help but notice your pain.
My pain.
It runs deep. Share it with me.
End simulation.